Hello there, everybody. We have one of, I think, our favorite interviews, Gennady Stolyarov II, and he's with us today again to talk. We promised everybody that we would have our follow-up after the elections. And so now it's after the elections. I myself am doing a lot, and I know you've been doing a lot too. The elections were kind of a surprise. I mean, now that I look back in hindsight, it might not be as much of a surprise when you evaluate it backwards, but you know how they say that about, it'd be nice if you could see that. I really did think that switching from Biden to Harris might have pulled it off. I actually did think that for a little while. And then it just kind of like almost like a boiling pot of water that started boiling less. It just kind of sizzled down more. And he kept going strong. And it went perfect for him, but it was interesting to me. I hope, and I'll say this and I'll turn it over to you, is I hope I was on the call one time with Elon about stuff, and I hope that in some ways, with some issues, I'm sure there's some issues that everybody won't agree with, but I think in some issues, Elon might be a buffering effect. I do like the fact that, Elon's into alternate technologies and power sources and space, and I think that'll progress, and probably his research with the neurochips and stuff, which could have an effect on lifespans and stuff and issues in people's brains. There's some things that I think Trump will be more willing to listen to. They might not have been without Elon. That's kind of how I feel about it. But so what do you think? What first hit you about this election?
Well, there are so many observations that I could share about the election results. I will say there was a mild surprise to me regarding the extent to which Trump won, the fact that he won all of the battleground states. And it wasn't even a contested victory. So if the vote counts had been sufficiently close that a recount could have made the difference, you can bet the Democrats would have asked for a recount. And to some extent, it's a relief that the election was decided quickly, that there wasn't a lot of contention, there wasn't a lot of heated rhetoric around the result. I'm glad that the Democrats conceded gracefully, and I fully support the notion of a peaceful transfer of power. I think that's essential to a civilized society. As is often said about democracy, democracy works based on ballots, not bullets. Even if one does not like the outcome, it is better to accept the outcome and work within the system to challenge some of the problems that arise from that outcome. With that being said, of course, I am not a Trump supporter, and the U.S. Transhumanist Party certainly did not support Trump. We ran our own candidates, Tom Ross and Daniel Tweed. And when we last spoke, I thought that also Kamala had a decent chance of pulling off a victory, but this was conditional on her being able to succeed with a narrative that she was a departure from the status quo. Because as I pointed out, in elections throughout the recent several years, and especially the recent year in the UK, in France, in Germany, and in other countries as well, the predominant sentiment is not left-wing or right-wing, it's anti-status quo, because the status quo has been terrible for ordinary people. People have suffered because of COVID. People have suffered because of inflation. People have suffered because of global geopolitical disruptions, the fallout from the war in Ukraine being a prime example, but also the conflict in the Middle East is having consequences for people everywhere in the world. And people want change. Now, most people are not deeply analytical. They don't look at issues in a comprehensive, well-researched manner. So essentially, they think, who's likely to win? And is that the person or the party in power? And if the answer is somebody is likely to win and they're not the party in power, they vote for that person. I think that is why Trump won. But Trump didn't have to be Trump to win. Keir Starmer of the Labour Party, who is very much unlike Trump, won in the UK. And the Tories, the Conservatives, lost in the UK. And that's the party of Boris Johnson, who is perhaps the most Trump-like politician in the UK. So Trump successfully communicated the narrative, especially with the help of J.D. Vance, who is more articulate and more erudite than Trump, that the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, would be a departure from the status quo, even though the first Trump administration was the status quo from 2017 to early 2021. But unfortunately, memories are short. So a lot of American voters have forgotten that, but they did remember the sufferings, the privations of the ensuing years, the drawn-out pandemic. And even though a lot of people like to ignore COVID now, the secondary and tertiary effects of COVID, particularly the economic effects and the societal rifts that it has caused, are still very much with us. So voters reacted in this manner. Now, I do not like the tendency of many people on the left to brand 50% of the population as evil. I do not believe that about rank and file Trump supporters. I think perhaps a lot of them have misplaced hopes in what the Trump administration is going to accomplish, but many of them are fundamentally good people, and they see very real problems in our society, and they see that the establishment, of which Trump is a part, by the way, but they choose to overlook that, the establishment does not adequately respond to those problems. We have a cost of living crisis in this country. Housing is now unaffordable for the upper middle class. Healthcare is unaffordable for a lot of Americans. Higher education is not only unaffordable, but it wages a kind of identity politics-based war against people solely based on the color of their skin, solely based on their gender or their national origin. And by the way, these people who are targeted don't have to be white men. They could be Asians. They could be Jewish. They could be immigrants from other countries. Like there's a severe situation with Russophobia on the American left now that is only paralleled by 1950s McCarthyism in the United States. And I think a lot of people from many constituencies, including a lot of Hispanic voters, a lot of Black voters, decided that this was not an acceptable situation anymore. And with the Democratic Party's reaction to this, I see some hope that there has been, I think, some serious consideration among many commentators, especially on the central left, about what went wrong. What could the Democrats have done better to reach those constituencies? I think the Democrats made some critical mistakes in allowing a very vocal and rather fanatical fringe to take over the messaging of their party, which used to be more about, let's say, appealing to the common man. And one could disagree with some of the economic policies there, but traditionally the Democratic Party was a party of, let's say, trying to give a fair shake to the common person, the working class person. And a lot of its historical base came from that. But when the Democratic Party switched to being the party of identity politics, the party that said, essentially, if you came from a group of people who were historically marginalized or oppressed, you were automatically good. And if you didn't come from such a group of people, irrespective of what the historical facts of that, then you had some inherent guilt or inherent class privilege, or worse, race-based or ethnicity-based privilege that you somehow had to atone for. And a lot of people were really frustrated by that because it ceased to be about who they were as individuals, and it became about essentially these arbitrary markers of race, ethnicity, national origin, what people 500 years ago might have done or 200 years ago. And when I talked to people who reacted against that in frustration, that was, I think, the predominant set of talking points that I heard. It's not even so much about any disagreements on economic policy or foreign policy, though some people cited the very foolish support of the war in Ukraine by the Democratic Party as a reason to vote against them. But this rampant identity politics, which has really poisoned the discourse over the past 10 years, has been, I think, a predominant motive for this reaction. Now, with that being said, again, is voting for Trump the best way to respond to that? I don't think so, because Trump is practicing a different kind of identity politics. Indeed, he has gone so far as supporting the mass deportation of millions of people who are here in this country peacefully. And these people, other than violating the immigration laws of this country, haven't committed other crimes by and large. They work, they pay taxes actually, and they don't collect as many benefits because it's hard to collect benefits if you don't have legal status. You don't want to expose yourself. And deporting these people, I worry, is going to create a police state, and it's going to create a mass crackdown on civil liberties, also with, unfortunately, a lot of discrimination based on people's national origin, based on the language that they speak, based on assumptions that law enforcement officers may make against them. And where I think the Democrats can acquit themselves is if they stand up against these mass deportations, which I think will be imminent once Trump takes office. If they really care about diversity, if they really care about accepting people irrespective of their national origins, and I'm skeptical about that on the part of the Democratic elite, but if they really care, they should stand up for these immigrants, and they should try to prevent them from being deported, and they should try to use legal maneuvers, civil disobedience, including civil disobedience by Democratic mayors, Democratic governors, refusing to cooperate with federal agents. And then let's see how far the Trump administration gets with these deportations. And one other thing, Biden is still president. He can offer an amnesty to the people who are currently in the United States. And the most successful example of an amnesty in American history was the amnesty of 1986 by no other than Ronald Reagan. And it's interesting how the parties have flipped on this issue to some extent, though the Democrats are by no means a pro-immigration party anymore. Biden has continued many of Trump's policies, including the building of the wall, apprehending immigrants at border crossings. He wasn't as bad in terms of the family separation policy under Trump, but he could have been a lot better. He could have been a lot more humane. And I want to challenge the Biden administration right now, especially because they have nothing to lose, especially because Biden has already pardoned a lot of people whom he probably shouldn't have pardoned, including his own son. Let's pardon some people who actually deserve it, like people who have done nothing wrong, who have broken no law other than crossing into this country illegally, and help them actually get a path to legal residency and eventually citizenship. That's what I think the Democrats ought to be doing. But right now, we don't have a true pro-immigration party in this country other than the US Transhumanist Party, where in our platform, we have many provisions supporting rational reforms to the legal immigration system that would make illegal immigration or undocumented immigration a lot less tempting and a lot less necessary in the eyes of many people. I will say also in regard to Elon Musk, I have always considered Elon Musk to be a person of mixed premises and mixed impacts. Clearly, he is a brilliant entrepreneur. His achievements in the realm of electric vehicles, in the realm of spaceflight and bringing down the costs of spaceflight, in the realm of solar energy, in the realm of ideation even for concepts like the Hyperloop or underground tunnels underneath cities or Neuralink. All of that has been exceptional. I think Elon often has a tendency to go way out of his depth. And on issues like the potential threat of artificial intelligence, I think he has overblown that threat. I think on life extension, he is completely off the mark in thinking that longevity would somehow lead to an ossification of society and reduced generation of new ideas. And I think some, not all perhaps, but some of his reforms under the name of government efficiency are also misguided, like mass firings of the federal workforce indiscriminately, I think are going to hamper the ability to implement effective reforms, because often the people who really know how the system is broken are the civil servants who have been operating in it for a long time. And also, often government agencies have fairly tight budgets, and civil servants have to work within those constraints. And as a result, they're able to achieve goals more efficiently than an outside party that may have a larger budget. But if the agencies hypothetically have the same mandate, but a lot less staff, and Vivek Ramaswamy has proposed 75% across the board cuts in the federal government, then somebody is going to have to do the work. So if you don't have employees, whom are you going to get? Contractors. And contractors are a lot more expensive than employees. Furthermore, they will often have their own agendas. And those agendas may be the agendas of their employers. Maybe some of those are affiliated with Musk or Ramaswamy. The question on that is still open. But even if that's not the case, even if there's not that kind of conflict of interest, these contractors' pay is going to swell the federal expenditures. It is much cheaper to do things in-house if one is running a government agency. So this is my main critique of DOGE, the so-called Department of Government Efficiency. I do think there is waste to be cut from federal spending. The $700 toilet seats that the Pentagon has purchased are just one example, but there are many wasteful programs, wasteful subsidies, for instance, that the Department of Agriculture provides either for farmers not to grow food or to prop up, say, the US sugar industry. That's just one example. But a lot of these reforms are going to face opposition from concentrated corporate interests that are actually the beneficiaries of the subsidies or the price supports or the very lavish contractual payments that they receive. And it's interesting that Musk and Ramaswamy are not targeting those. They're not targeting anything that these favored politically connected corporations are actually benefiting from. Instead, they're targeting middle-class civil servants who, by and large, are paid less than their counterparts in the private sector. So I have some doubts that DOGE will achieve its intended goals. I think it will cause a lot of disruption, but disruption and innovation are not necessarily the same things. I think to really reform federal spending, to really achieve greater efficiency in government, one needs to listen to people on the front lines. One needs to listen to people who have been doing these jobs for a long time and who see all the flaws in the system. Flaws that people from a top-down perspective, people who are removed from the reality on the ground by several layers, or people who are just outsiders and who have some ideas but don't recognize that those ideas might have been tried 5 times already and have led to certain results that didn't quite work out. That's a perspective that those people just wouldn't have. So those are my thoughts about the future of the Trump administration. I will add one more. RFK Jr. is inimical to transhumanism, in my view. He is a techno-Luddite. He has fought against 20th century medicine, and in some cases, 19th century medicine. I don't see how people could consider his administration to be able to have a positive effect in promoting the medicine of the 21st century, the life extension treatments, if he's against the polio vaccine and wants to ban the polio vaccine. How in the world is he going to loosen up the FDA's approval criteria for emerging gene therapies, which are really unnatural by his definition? It's not eating organic food and practicing what he would consider a healthy lifestyle, which is more like a back to nature lifestyle. It is radically altering the human genome in order to cure, at first, inherited diseases, but later on in order to cure the disease of aging that afflicts all of us. What is RFK Jr. going to say about that? I doubt he will be a receptive audience to those efforts. So I am not optimistic on that front. But I think I've offered a fairly broad critique now, and I'd be interested in your thoughts as well.
I have none. End of the show. No, I'm kidding. It's interesting, some of the things you brought up. Let me hit a couple of things. I worked for the government. I worked local, state, and federal. And I would see some of the spending problems. And the problem is they try to do, and this is, you got to keep this in mind with a lot of things with government. They try to do things that are good and somehow gets taken advantage of. The way I used to see that thing with the expensive items is we'd have to buy things from a mom pop store. We couldn't go to the big box store and buy an item. Like we couldn't go to Lowe's or Sears at the time when Sears had things you could use to fix sinks and equipment. We had to go to a mom pop store. Well, what would happen then is one time I needed a new hair dryer, not a hair dryer, but a heat gun, because I was doing a chemical experiment, and you catch it in the fibers, which kind of reminds you of kitty litter, you want a good way. The gas passes through, it's caught in those fiber crystally things, and you have to then heat them real fast to get that back off what you want that stays in them. Well, to buy this, that's probably more description than I needed for what I was saying, though. But to get that that heat gun, you had to go through a mom pop. Well, the same heat gun I could have gone to get at Sears was like 4 times priced higher through the mom pop store. The same exact item. And they came out with a policy that was supposed to help mom and pop stores. But then what you did is the mom and pop stores were taking advantage of it. They were raising the prices because they knew we had to come to them. So they were making it more expensive because we couldn't go to the place and buy it cheaper. And I thought, in other words, what I'm trying to say is the government was trying to do the right thing, but it kind of went the wrong way. And like you said about cutting people, then they'd have to do contractors. My experience with government is they do that. And then they also they call it streamlining the process, which means there's a lot of process they don't do anymore, which is what it really means. They're not really streamlining it. It isn't the same process. It doesn't do everything the old process did, which here's a factor with that is, okay, they could fire the people, streamlining the process. Okay, that can look good. Then here's what you got to love with government or administrations is, so that runs for their administration into some of the next administration, and it goes bottom up because you did streamline it, but you stopped doing things you should have done, and therefore whatever that program was meant to do was no longer doing it, and now that's causing a problem. So then of course that looks like the next administration doesn't know what they're doing, and the other administration and people just say it's because they didn't stop administrating that program the way it should be. But that happens, and the problem with that is I see is then maybe you had gotten rid of 75% of your people, but once there's a problem comes back out, you might need to rehire 80%, 90% to take care of the mistake that happened from you cutting people and streamlining in the first place. So, sometimes, what I'm saying is it can become more complex other than them just spending more money. They can do all kinds of things that starts it on and I like the way you said about, you worked for government long enough. We won't admit to anything for you since you're still working for them. But as far as you said about administrations and people coming in and trying something that's been tried before, we see that all the time. New administrations come in. This is government in government agencies. They come in and they have these great new ideas. And everybody that's been there a long time, like, scratches their chin or their head and goes, we tried that already. 10 years ago, we tried that and it didn't work. But you can't really say that and they don't believe you, or they say, well, you didn't do it right. It's a good idea then, it's a good idea now. we're going to do it right. And they really have no clue. They're trying to recreate the wheel, basically. And the closest they get is maybe a hexagonal shape, that rolls better than a square, but, not quite good enough. And those are some interesting things, though, that I've seen in government. And I could see happening now with this, but then what's going to happen is Trump does play on the people. And he says things that people want to say that they shouldn't probably say if they really thought about it sometimes. So lots of things we think about saying that we don't say. And I think that appeals to them. They're like, oh, yeah, they're cutting this money and stuff, and makes them feel good. And in the future, they'll say, yeah, Trump cut all this money and stuff. And, I think there are some things he's probably going to make better. And I think there's some things he's not going to make better. It surprises me how much people are behind him. And I've been watching some interesting videos I found, and they talk about his body language and how some of the things that those of us that might pick it apart and analyze what he's doing might think, oh, that's kind of funny and that's kind of silly. But it kind of appeals to a sense of a part of a person's brain where he shows his dominance. He shows he's dominant, and he shows a strong front, which I think to some people that gets into their brain, and it might not even be their conscious brain. It might even be their subconscious brain, and enforces him as a strong person and therefore a strong leader. And I think that's interesting because in some ways, I think it appeals to a primitive part of the brain. And I don't mean that to insult anybody, but I mean, it does seem like that's what it's doing. And it was interesting to me. I still get on Clubhouse, although that's kind of a dying thing. I remember Dan used to talk about Clubhouse and stuff. And it surprised me listening to people talk about the immigrants and about the election and things I was hearing, which really surprised me. I heard women saying how they felt Harris wasn't a strong leader because she was a woman. They didn't even perceive her as being a strong leader just because she was a woman. And I was really shocked by this, to hear this from other women, and to again realize the deep-rooted things that people think and represent things with. I mean, we've had the Queen of England, we've had Margaret Thatcher. I mean, we've had other countries that have had women leaders that did quite well, but in this country, we really haven't. And it's still represented. It was odd for me to hear women going against her because she was a woman instead of backing her, saying, yeah, we've got to get another woman in office, where they felt she wasn't strong enough being a woman. And that surprised me. I also heard the fears of different minorities about the Hispanics. And I won't go into too much detail, but I heard them complaining about the Hispanics, not just Mexicans, but, now everybody kind of gears a Hispanic as being a Mexican because of this riled up, which I think other Hispanics have to watch. But talking about how they were coming into their communities, and their communities were starting to be less of their minority and more of the Hispanic. And this was on both coasts. And it's interesting to me because I knew historically, and I think people need to pay more attention to history. And I think there is a definite lack of people listening to true history, not just the history of the conqueror. You have the history of the conqueror and the history of the true history. But those same areas on both the East and West Coast, there at one time had been a huff about the minorities that are now complaining about the other minorities taking over. And I'm like, you're doing the exact same thing to them that people did to you that you did not like. And I mean, I know you weren't born in this country, and I mean, some of my generations were first born in this country, and I still remember a time I visited my great grandfather's house in Germany, and I feel this country is built on immigrants. And there was a time when all of our families were made fun of and put down by other groups, so there is kind of a progression of one group comes in and they kind of take over, another group comes in and that group makes fun of them until that group kind of becomes the normal, until another group comes in. And when I was a kid, people still made fun of Italians and Polacks like crazy. Back when I was a kid, nobody cares if you're Italian or Polish now, that you become integrated into the society as you're a red-blooded American now. That's viewed as, but I still remember when people made fun of that. And, I'm mostly German. I came from an area in Pennsylvania where it was still mostly German, Pennsylvania Deutsch, Pennsylvania Dutch. And that was the predominant, but there was a time when they came into the people didn't like them too, so it's interesting how it progresses. And it's interesting to hear how the people talk about it. But I have to admit, my biggest shocker wasn't that, it was the women thinking that Harris was not going to be a strong leader because she was a woman. They really, unless it was, some of it could have been the comparison of how they perceived Trump making her as a woman look maybe less confident in their eyes. But I was really shocked by that. I thought that the women would really want to back her. And although I do think some did, I'm surprised by how many did not and saw her weak as a woman. And it's interesting how that happens. I was really surprised by that.
Well, it's interesting. I would say there is a high likelihood of a female president, perhaps even a Black female president in the United States during, let's say, the next 2 decades. However, she would need to be a conservative female president. So I think it's quite likely that the Republican Party at some point may run essentially a Condoleezza Rice type of candidate. Condoleezza Rice herself is too old to run at this point, but
Right.
she would be the kind of woman whom I think a lot of Republicans would be able to back. And she actually is a multi-talented individual. She played in a chamber orchestra, actually. There's a recording that one can find of her while she was the national security advisor. So that, I think, is
Help her
perhaps
win your heart,
perhaps that sentiment that you described is a bit more flexible. I think Kamala was seen as somebody who essentially came out of the shadows, so to speak, because for a long time during the Biden administration itself, she was on the sidelines, essentially. She wasn't a crucial voice in determining politics. People like Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and more disastrously, Victoria Nuland were in charge of a lot of policy decisions. And Kamala was there. She was doing some things on the side, but she wasn't playing a central role. She was playing a more traditional vice presidential role, which is to be there, be present for photo ops, but take a lighter hand when it comes to policy. And I think a lot of people saw what was a rather abrupt change in the narrative. For about a year between the summer of 2023 and the summer of 2024, the Democratic Party establishment and the many allied media conglomerates were solidly in favor of Joe Biden, and they dismissed any concerns about his physical or mental state as being almost unpatriotic. And it seemed like there was this solid wall of support for Biden's decision to run again. They railroaded all the Democrats to conform with that. There were some attempted challenges from candidates like Dean Phillips and Gabriel Cornejo, Frankie Lozada, few others, even Cenk Uygur, though he wasn't born in the United States. I'm glad that he ran to challenge that prohibition in the US Constitution, but the Democratic Party essentially marginalized all of them. And yet, after that disastrous first debate performance between Trump and Biden, where Biden claimed to have finally beat Medicare, though I actually know what he was trying to say there, by the way. He was saying that they were able to finally reform Medicare so as to be able to negotiate the prices of certain prescription drugs with drug manufacturers and thus reduce the costs that Medicare would have to pay on behalf of its patients. So that's what he was trying to say, but it got jumbled in his mind. And people realized, oh, he really is unfit to serve for another 4-year term. And the narrative switched essentially overnight, with many of these leading media/propaganda institutions now trying to pressure Biden to step down. And for about 3 weeks, they were amplifying that pressure until I think he really had no choice. And they elevated Kamala, again, without really a serious discussion of what the alternatives would be. And Kamala changed overnight from a person who was essentially on the sidelines to a person who somehow now had a central role in not just the future of the administration, but to some extent the present of the administration. And I think that was a tactical mistake that J.D. Vance in particular was able to exploit. Because if you recall, in his debate with Tim Walz, J.D. Vance was talking about the Harris administration. He was talking about how Kamala made this and that mistake. And the content of that didn't really matter as much as Vance's success in attributing the poor impression that a lot of Americans had of the Biden administration to Kamala Harris. And on the other hand, Kamala Harris was locked in a bit of a bind because she couldn't go too overtly against Joe Biden. That would upset her backers within the Democratic Party and within the current White House. And furthermore, she was still the vice president. So if she criticized the administration too much, people would ask questions like, well, why didn't you do anything about it? You are still quite a powerful individual. Why didn't you influence the administration to change course? So Kamala had to, in a subtler way, try to signal that she was different, that she was going to pursue a different path. And when we last spoke, I thought that perhaps she might still have a chance of pulling it off, depending on how rhetorically effective she was. And it's not so much that she made terrible blunders on the campaign trail. I think she held her own in her debate against Trump. And I think she even was able to provoke Trump into acting essentially in his tantrum-like ways, accusing everybody of being after him and so forth, which is really not a favorable look for him. But I think she was unable to create a compelling narrative of how she would be different from the status quo that so many Americans felt like they were struggling under. Now, in terms of people who feel like they're struggling, Trump's advantage, and this goes to your other point, is that unlike other members of the political establishment, he has been able to figure out a rhetorical strategy that speaks to a segment of the American public, which that establishment has essentially disdained. And these are the working class, predominantly Caucasian, but not always. Some of them are Hispanic, some of them are Black individuals, often in the Rust Belt states, but again, not always. Generally states with a lot of industries that are based on physical labor and that are based on a predominantly non-college educated workforce. The Democratic Party, again, used to be the party of the common man, and it has transformed largely into being the party with a constituency of, I will say this, upper class, white, educated, liberal-leaning people who sometimes will say that they are allies of minority groups, but actually many of them will tactically use these minority groups to achieve their goals. And this is why they're not really consistent adherents to the principles of diversity that they claim to champion. They only champion the rights of minority groups who are likely to give them some political allegiance. But if there are minority groups, say Russians, who are not convenient to their agenda, they will oppose those minority groups and even smear them in disgraceful ways. So I think what Trump figured out is that there's a segment of the American electorate that has been left out. And sometimes these people, unfortunately, lack the kind of discernment to see through Trump's populist rhetoric. And they have certain frustrations. They don't know quite where those frustrations stem, but they do know that something has to change. And Trump is telling them, oh, it's these other people who are causing the problems. It's the immigrants. And that's the oldest trick in the book. That's essentially saying, oh, if you get rid of
somewhere else, you know?
Right. If you get rid of these other so-called bad people, then your problems will go away. But the unfortunate reality is these problems are structural. There's not one group of people. There's not one easy, convenient target that can be dislodged. And as you said, it's not specific to a given ethnic group because the dynamics of power are fairly predictable. So this is another problem with the left-wing identity politics narrative, which casts certain groups of people as always oppressors and certain other groups as always victims. No, it's a matter of who gets to the dominant position in a society without having, let's say, an enlightened view of governance. And it could be anybody in the position of oppressor. It could be anyone in the position of the oppressed. It's just a matter of sometimes the accidents of history, but sometimes perhaps a failure to learn the lessons of history.
I do, like I said before, I agree about the history very much so. That is a good point. Years ago, I probably early 2000s already, maybe even before that, I started feeling like what was thought of as Democrat and what was thought as Republican was shifting. Just sort of like you said, it kind of shifted to where you felt for a long time, I felt like they were both saying the same thing. It wasn't like you said, like neither one of them was really for the common person anymore, which is a good point that's why then they go to Trump, who's says he's going to solve those problems. And that's a good point. I think it did get to be a point where the politicians, no matter what party they were, became a good old group of a good old sort of group of guys and people and families. And, like they joke about the Illuminati, you know what I mean? You had your families and your people in power from politics and from, businesses and stuff. It's like, I like the Kennedys. I was old enough I remember seeing John getting shot in the first place. And, you remember those days and stuff, and it was, different and interesting. But those families still owe pull, and they're related families. And I think both the Democrats and the Republicans became a good old boy kind of thing, and no longer catered to the working person, but it was the people that already kind of made themselves a little bit elitist. But, I see that a lot in politics, though, too. And even in state and local government, that happens. I don't always go against the good old boy things because I think it's nice when you help out your own. But to some extent, when you get to a point where you don't see or you can't, the people in charge can no longer really see the issues. Maybe that's a way to say it.
Mm-hmm.
I think they don't understand the issues because they don't have those issues.
Yes.
It isn't the same to them. And I think when they get that disconnect, I think you kind of hit on that. I think both parties had kind of lost that connection, and that doesn't really apply to what the majority and the common man thinks about or dreams about or wants or needs help with. I mean, I know all these problems aren't as easy to solve as sometimes they make them sound. Like I said with the government, you streamline it, you cut it out. Sometimes that just causes other problems later on that then cost you more money to fix. But, I've seen that, things flop the other way. And, there was a time where I'm like, are they Democrats or are they Republicans? I'm not really sure what their purpose was. And I grew up thinking Republicans were all the rich people who only cared about their money and stuff, and the Democrats were for the common person working for the common man. And then later on, it just got to be everybody was someone in power in some way, was in politics, and politics takes money to be in too. There's part of that being part of the, I don't know, part of the evil of the job. You need to get people to back you to put you in, then you get corporations that back you, and then once you're in, they want you to do things that they want you to do to help them because they helped you. And where anymore is it about helping the people that are really the core of what you're supposed to be? It's interesting. I don't know though, but I mean, revolution, no, and then if you have a revolution, you just have other problems too. So I hope it works its way out in a nice manner. And like you said, with this transition of power so far, it seems like it's going to be nice and smooth. It already feels to me like people aren't even thinking of Biden as president anymore. They're already talking about Trump as if he's already the president, which is kind of interesting to me. I don't know if you see that, but I seem to see that trend. That's interesting to me too. So this is going to be pretty mild, and that's nice. And, I just like to say too, it's like, I've seen people switching over to support Trump when they realized Trump was going to be the winner. And people that didn't like him in the first place, liked him, including the vice president. But, I think at this point, we have to try to work within the system and within who is now the governing body of our country, and try to work within that framework that we now have, and plan for 4 years and see what we can do when the next 4 years come about. Maybe we can have people finally listen to a third party or the idea of third parties and stuff, but do it from more within the system, and not a revolutionary type idea, but working with it to get somewhere, not against it, as in making so much friction that it's a horrible 4 years. Now, I do also worry about, I don't know your thoughts on this, but Trump made the comment that you would never have to do an election again after this, which made some people worry that he would try to be King or Emperor Trump and maybe change it that you don't have to reelect, or you could run for more than 2 terms. And I don't know, what do you think about that? Do you think that he could be thinking about that or try to get away with that? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think the context of the comment that he made was to a group of Christian voters who perhaps were morally opposed to some aspects of Trump's background or ideas, because from, say, a fundamentalist Christian perspective, Trump isn't exactly a moral paragon. And I think what he was telling them is, look, just hold your noses and vote for me this once, and then I will fix so many problems that you could stay home and not have to vote in the next election. I think that's what he could be interpreted as saying if one were to give, let's say, the benefit of the doubt to Trump. Now, I don't know how many people want to give him the benefit of the doubt in this case.
I like that version. I'm afraid that it could be the other version, though. But that's something that makes me a little worried. I'm not sure. I could see him trying to do that, or at least thinking about it and pondering it long enough as an idea. So I'm just saying, I just, kind of threw that out there. That's a concern that he would try to do that.
Well, I think Trump is in a bit of a bind. And I actually think one reason why he ran for office this time was because he saw it as his way out of the consequences of all of these prosecutions that he was experiencing. And the Democrats really went after him, especially in the aftermath of January 6th, 2021. And chances are Trump probably would not have gone to jail because he has a lot of money to pay a lot of attorneys, and he would have appealed and appealed and appealed. But he would have been embattled for the next 4 years. And now all of these cases against him are going to be dropped. And Trump essentially saw winning the presidency again as his ticket out of these legal troubles. I will also say my impression is Trump did not actually intend to win in 2016. He intended to run against Hillary, and he probably believed the mainstream narrative that, of course, Hillary was going to win, all of the polls will be in her favor, then he could allege some sort of rigging or malfeasance, have his own TV show, have his millions of fans, and essentially resurrect the Trump brand that way, because Trump's various enterprises were struggling financially before the 2016 election. So this was Trump essentially rebranding, reasserting himself, getting a lot more followers and a lot more revenue. And then he actually got elected president. And I think his feeling was, what in the world do I do now? I have to at least try to deliver on some of those promises. And the tragedy with Trump is he actually does try to fulfill his promises. This was an aspect of him that surprised me, because I thought he was more like the typical opportunistic politician, where he would deploy rhetoric for the purpose of galvanizing certain constituencies, but he wouldn't quite go there when it came to actual policy. He did actually try to build the wall. He did actually try to implement a lot of his policy proposals, but during his first term, a lot of the people whom he hired were more conventional Republicans or conventional establishment types, and that led to a lot of disorganization, a lot of friction, a lot of conflicting agendas within his first administration. With his second administration, I think he is recruiting more, let's say, maverick type people, people who have become famous in their own right for whatever reason, like Elon Musk or RFK Jr. or Tulsi Gabbard, whom I respect a lot more than RFK Jr., but people who have stood out for some prior advocacy of theirs, or some might say some prior achievement of theirs. And he has formed this coalition of essentially people who have some claim to being unconventional, which could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. It depends on the particular realm of policy and the particular directions in which those people would try to take the agency or the area of policy that they have oversight over. But I do think it's important to recognize Trump is a scion of a wealthy and politically connected dynasty. He himself is tightly connected with the US political establishment. He used to be a Democrat, by the way, so for him, the party labels don't really matter that much. He mostly does not operate based on principle. He operates based on this kind of political opportunism where he tries to capture the sentiments of constituencies that he thinks will thereby support him. But then to stay in power, he has to try to deliver on those promises. So unfortunately, I think that means he will try the mass deportations. Fortunately, I think that also means he will try to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. So on the foreign policy front, I'm a bit more hopeful, and I'm trying to be balanced in this assessment. So I have said a lot about the detrimental effects that I think the Trump administration will have. But I think on the foreign policy front, he may have some positive effects as well. Now, what you said about essentially both parties catering to a certain establishment, a political elite, I think that's very true. And I think often, indeed, the attitudes among, let's say, influential Democrats are essentially the attitudes of resentful and rebellious children of the influential Republicans. So it's often the case that really the Democrats with their attitudes, they're from the same class, they may be from even the same families. They just don't like something that their parents believe or their parents are doing, except their parents are aging and dying. So often it's the case that they've come into that wealth and that influence. And now what do? Because they have taken on all of these rhetorical positions, but now they are the elite. So it's not like they can actually substantially reform the system. With that being said, violent revolution of any sort would be disastrous, and any sort of exacerbation of the polarization of our society would be disastrous as well, because to really succeed, a revolution isn't just going to be the outpouring of some anger on the part of the general public, because the general public or poor people or working class people are not sufficiently well organized to carry it out. Essentially, every revolution to be successful requires some sort of counter elite. And that counter elite is not necessarily going to be better than the elite that it displaces. Indeed, we've seen throughout history the English Civil War and revolution of the French Revolution of 1789 to 1794, especially the Russian Revolution of 1917. There were two revolutions, actually. The second was, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution. What we saw in those revolutions was not a spontaneous outpouring of anger. It was a new elite displacing the old elite, except the old elite had grown kind of soft, maybe a bit neglectful, but they were not willing to resort to the same kinds of severe measures, including severe persecutions of both people of the old elite and people in the general public, that the new elite, the rising elite, was willing to do. So what I too hope for is a gradual transformation from a societal perspective, but a fast transformation from a technological perspective. And the technological transformations would, of course, inform the societal transformations, but they would also take the pressure off, because technology generally opens up more opportunities. Technology raises standards of living. It leads people to be able to pursue their own aspirations in life to a greater extent, rather than feeling like they have no recourse other than to storm government buildings with pitchforks or Molotov cocktails. So technology gives people a better path, a more peaceful path, and one would hope that over time, the structural problems that we have discussed will be alleviated by technological progress. And instead of this pressure rising and boiling over, it essentially fizzles out. It's like if you open a bottle of a carbonated beverage very gradually and let that pressure seep out, then you won't get this explosion of foam. And that's my hope. And it's an important hope as well, because we need underlying societal stability, and we need the stability of our infrastructure to persist if we want to have continued technological progress and biomedical advances. There aren't going to be biomedical advances if there's blood in the streets, if people are worried about their immediate safety, if the infrastructure of our roads, our airports, our medical care doesn't work anymore because there's a civil war. But there will be medical progress if the general environment is calm. So if we don't have major societal upheavals in the next 15 years, I think chances are good that we will achieve a degree of damage reversal to the body where we can actually rejuvenate people. And then people will have a lot to look forward to in terms of greatly extended longevity, but also greatly extended health and youthfulness.
That was nice. Yeah, that was nice tie-in with the transhumanism. I do agree with you, like you said, though. They talk about grassroots movements, and yeah, but usually the person provoking, or shall I say provoking, shall I say organizing the grassroots thing, a lot of times they are a different kind of elitist than the one that they're going against. And that is very true. And a lot of times, I hate to say it, we've talked about this before. A lot of times throughout history, the people that did science, they did art and stuff, they had some more money than some of the other people. That's what allowed them to pursue those things because they weren't stuck in just working every day hard. They had the ability to pursue it and stuff. And that does seem to be what happens. And I know sometimes people don't think that's fair. And then they call it elitist, but sometimes they're the people that had the opportunity to work on those things. And like you said, if the infrastructure goes to hell, everybody becomes back down to that level where they don't have time to work on that stuff. Now, we had, like you said, we had Tom Ross as your presidential candidate this term and Dan as your vice president. How do you think anything different going ahead for the next 4 years, or anything you're planning different maybe to get the Transhumanist Party out there and recognized and seen more and maybe acknowledged more by the general populace? Anything you seem doing different or plan to do different over the next 4 years?
I think we need to build more of a network of on-the-ground activism, looking at various proposals at the state and local levels and how they relate to the goals and positions of the Transhumanist Party, see where we can make a difference in either supporting or opposing certain proposals, depending on our outlook on them. And I think in any locality where we seek to make an impact, we need to build a network of activists who are able to respond to developments there, as well as field more local candidates. And this could be in alliance with other political parties as well. So we held a series of meetings last week, including our virtual Enlightenment Salon, with representatives of the US Pirate Party. And we find that a lot of their platform planks align with ours as well. And we were quite impressed at the degree of commonality, though, of course, the Transhumanist Party also focuses on many areas that the Pirate Party would not, but where we do overlap, there is a great deal of agreement. So if the Pirate Party were to field candidates in certain jurisdictions, the Transhumanist Party could certainly endorse many of those candidates via, of course, a vote of our members. And the Pirate Party could do likewise with candidates that the Transhumanist Party puts forth. And I think just having these people in our network and people from other minor political parties as well will lead to more effective issue-specific collaboration. So for the next 2 years, I think we will be focused on that as an added element of our strategy, and hopefully recruiting more volunteers, recruiting more legislative analysts. We are already beginning efforts in that direction. Over a broader time scale, I think we need to do something dramatically different in regard to running presidential candidates. I think we do need to continue running presidential candidates on behalf of the US Transhumanist Party, because we have now done that for 3 election cycles with Zoltan Istvan in 2016, Charlie Cam and Liz Parrish in 2020, and now Tom Ross and Daniel Tweed in 2024. But I think what we need to do in 2028 would be a radically innovative step. And that's all I will say about that, but stay tuned. And in the meantime, we would like anybody who wants to get involved in a truly different vision of American politics, one that would bring about dramatic transformation for the better without any sort of violent revolution or escalation of tensions, please join us for free at transhumanist-party.org/membership. And that way you will be apprised of our activities. You will be able to participate in our internal votes and help make a difference, help realize that plan. We are going to be actively responding as well to the policy proposals of the Trump administration. Again, we try to be objective. As I've said before, we play the role of the loyal opposition, and we have under the first Trump administration, we have under the Biden administration, and we will continue to play that role under the second Trump administration. We would have also been the loyal opposition if Kamala Harris had won. But being the loyal opposition means we're ready to call out bad ideas and bad proposals. At the same time, what we're loyal to is the US Constitution and the fundamental peaceful ways within the American system to address and resolve differences, even if those ways sometimes lead to frustration because certain channels may not be easy to navigate. We still have our right of free speech. We still have our ability to offer commentary on what is happening. We still have the ability to propose better ideas and better solutions, and also recognize the good when it happens. Like if Trump succeeds in achieving a negotiated peace in Ukraine, I personally will celebrate, and I will not hesitate to praise that as a resolution that will save many lives and also save money for the American taxpayer and make the world a much safer place. So I think if those of you who are interested in a policy-driven, objective, nuanced approach want to contribute to that, you should join the Transhumanist Party, and we would welcome you.
Well, I think we had talked before. I had interviewed some of the guys from the Alliance Party, and they had mentioned about going in with other third parties, candidates that get elected and making coalitions. And I will try and get a meeting or a salon together with them. I just haven't gotten to it yet. I'm working on some other projects on the side. But, that would be nice too, is not necessarily even, helping each other with their parties the same. But once you're in power as third parties, supporting each other with coalitions within to help with gain the power like the other parties do. So you're not swimming out there by yourself feeling unsupported. And I think that's a nice idea. I think eventually that might not work. Eventually it's a way, I think, for the third parties to gain some strength. But then eventually once they gain strength, they're probably going to want to be on their own again anyhow. But in this time period where third parties need to gain strength, I think that would be a great idea. Like you said, with the Pirate Party, I mean, I don't know if we have to necessarily agree with everything, either one of us, just each of us support each other as third parties and help us both grow and get to a point where we have to worry about one of us winning over the other. We're not at that point. But if the third parties can all support each other and work together to gain some power and to make the two big parties realize that there's somebody else out there. And I think occasionally they do. I think sometimes the other parties might shift themselves a little bit when they hear about something. But then I think what they try to do is say it's their idea and kind of absorb it into themselves and not give credit to where it came from. So I think, a lot of the third parties, I think hopefully will work together more in the future too. And I think that's a good idea, for strength and stability of the third party as, I don't know how you could call it, a multi-headed creature that needs to help grow itself. Before the individual heads maybe can always be heard, maybe the whole creature itself needs to gain in strength. I don't know. I'm just having this vision in my head,
It's like a Hydra. It reminds me of Hydra DAO, which was founded by Kai Micah Mills, and we're going to be having a virtual Enlightenment Salon with him this Sunday, December 22nd at 1 p.m. Pacific time. Hydra DAO is focused on growing replacement parts, biological replacement parts for humans. So it's interesting that you made this analogy to the third party alliance being essentially a Hydra.
It's a synchronicity there with that. But yeah, I think we all need to grow in strength. And I think the thing is, a lot of the third party parties, I think you are going to find have a lot more similarities than probably dissimilarities because of them wanting to improve things and make things better and different. So I tell you what, we've probably done a good amount of time here. I don't know what else you'd want to cover or say, but why don't you plug some of the things like the Salon and stuff, and we will probably get back together. I don't know how much time we'll get back together into this and see how this term is going. I hope to meet with Tom Ross in a couple weeks. I'll be out in Denver. I'm going to also hopefully meet with another Tom friend. I might turn that into more of a discussion of music, but also still hit on the presidency and stuff too, because all of us have some musical, like you have some musical stuff yourself also, some musical things going on. So I'm hoping to get Tom on another one, and we might sidetrack more to music, but that'll be great to have him on again. Do one of my, transhumanists in coffee shops having coffee.
Yes, indeed. So our virtual Enlightenment salons are streamed every Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time on my YouTube channel, which is G. Stolyarov II, the first letter of my first name, followed by my last name, followed by 2 I's. And these are in-depth, often conversations on science, philosophy, politics, culture, art, and the interrelations among all of these fields, because this is how we make progress, by connecting insights from various disciplines. But sometimes for the salons, we will have musical streams as well. So we had in 2022 a virtual concert of futuristic neoclassical music composed by me and remastered by our legislative director, Jason Geringer. We had a virtual jazz concert with compositions by one of our members, Daniel Berhe. And then we also had an AI-generated Baroque Grand Concerto that I curated using outputs from the UDO version 1.5 AI. It is called the 52 Weeks because it includes 52 movements, each representing 1 week of the year. And it's accompanied as well by mostly AI-generated art. The capabilities of both artistic and musical AIs have come astonishingly far in just the past 2 years. I look back at the AI art that I generated back in 2022, and now with the degree of precision, the degree of realism that I am seeing from today's AI art generators, they have advanced by leaps and bounds. And I think this is an area where there's a lot of hope, again, technologically driven hope for the transhumanist movement in 2025 to leverage these technologies and show how much they can improve human productivity, how much they can add to our creativity as well, how they could empower us as individuals and how they could empower us as third parties or minor political parties to do good in the world. And I think this is where, despite all of the political upheavals, despite the polarization, the very tense geopolitical situation as well, there is reason to be hopeful about the future of humanity. There is reason to see a possible light at the end of this tunnel where the advancement of technologies, as long as those technologies are deployed wisely and rationally and for good purposes, can really overcome these problems and liberate us to do better things and do them for much longer than most of us ever expected. So I will leave our audience with this message of hope, and please tune in to our virtual Enlightenment salons and explore the past recordings of the salons on my YouTube channel as well, because we have now close to 250 of these long-form streams that one can derive a wealth of knowledge and enjoyment from.
Well, thank you for being with us again. And, I do like your bright look on what you hope the future do. I have to admit, being older, I've gotten more cynical as I've gotten older, but I think that might happen to you as you get older. But thank you again for being with us. Like I said, we will do this again. We will hear how, we've seen things changing and how you feel about it. I know sometimes I have some interesting feelings about things, but you know, sometimes man surprises me, and it's not always in a good way, but sometimes it is in a good way. So I hope for that bright future. And thank you again, and I will talk to you soon and see you soon. Hopefully, everybody will. And if they want to see you sooner than see you here, go on to your salon. I will make sure all the links are down below, as I always put them. And eventually, then this will also be up on your channel also. And I wish you the best as always. And we will do another one of these real soon. Thank you very much. And let's not forget to live long and prosper.
Live long and prosper.